So first of all, my background is primarily on Ibadi manuscript traditions in Northern Africa rather than the Arabian Peninsula. So that's the primary frame of reference for me. And I'm immediately struck, just I have to say, by a remarkable set of similarities in terms of the overlap between certain kinds of geographic distributions of the manuscript traditions that have been discussed, the linguistic landscape and how the linguistic landscape, as Maria talked about, is linked to the distribution of religious communities in a really fascinating way. And then there are also things that perhaps we didn't talk as much about, like a colonial history for the region that may or may not have had an effect on the distribution of manuscripts inside and outside of Ethiopia, as well as a modern history, which I'm sure everyone is more than aware of, that North Africa and the Horn of Africa share of civil unrest in modern history that certainly had its effect on material heritage. So I just wanted to sort of lay those things out there at the beginning, because they're, at least from my perspective, things that I often don't draw connections among different regions, but there are really good theoretical and analytical reasons to be thinking in those shared terms. Then I'll really quickly just go through each of the presentations in the order, and forgive me, but I have to look down at my notes or I'd go on forever. So Maria, I thought that one of the most fascinating things about your presentation that also draws a comparison is the potential glaring contradictions between these different kinds of evidence that you have, and what to do with that analytically. And I would be interested to know from other panelists whether manuscript evidence, and I noticed there are a couple questions like this, whether the manuscript tradition can help solve some of those or maybe add additional complications. And it sounds like, especially with what Anne said, it sounds like we could have some new questions about circulation of texts and contradictions in the historical narrative. Alessandro, I was, again, it's just a sort of amazing set of comparative points with the Ibadi manuscript traditions in North Africa, also an incredibly small collection, I mean, relative to other places, in the world. But also to sort of tie yours with Hassan's presentation, what we heard from Hassan's presentation, I'm also struck by the very important role for private manuscript libraries all the way up into the present as the sites for the preservation of that manuscript tradition. And one of the things that complicates that, of course, is the lack of access, perhaps the lack of resources for conservation that I know there have been projects to help those folks, but it'll be interesting to hear more about that. I'd also be really interested, related to that, to hear from either or both of you about whether those private collections have remained private for reasons beyond simply the idiosyncrasies of their owners. If there has been, for example, a hesitancy or reluctance to share those manuscripts with people from outside of the community, or to draw from my own experience, especially a distrust of the state, the modern nation state, and not wanting to give them control of it because you really don't trust them to do what you think should be done with them. And then also, I know that this will be really clear to a lot of you in the audience as well as the panelists, that remarkable change from the 18th century forward in the number of manuscripts is also worth thinking about. And I saw somebody asked a question, so I won't ask it about watermarks and the history of paper, but I would love to hear the answer to that question. Hassan, in addition to what I asked, I'd be really interested to know whether the geographic distribution of those private libraries tells you anything beyond just where they are. So if there's anything you can draw out of where the private collections are, where they've remained and where they're no longer, if there are political histories that are tied to why those collections continue to exist beyond just there are Muslims here, are there things to say beyond that? And then finally, Anne, what a wonderful reminder of how important it is to do comparative work on the circulation of text, because it's so funny. This happens to me all the time, and I'm sure it's happened to many of you. You go somewhere and you think, oh, they read that book here too. And it's not the one that you might expect them to, right? It's not Minhaj Talibin. It's a more unusual text, especially one that doesn't seem to fit with the religious landscape of the region. So I occasionally run into Sufi texts or Hanbali texts in Ibadi libraries, and you're wondering, what is this doing here? And it would be interesting to know if you have some other examples of that kind of thing happening and how you sort of explain it. And in addition, and this is a question sort of for everyone because I'm coming in from the outside and it's a very selfish question and comment, but I'm interested to know if there has been any reflection on the movement of these texts out of Ethiopia. And in particular, I'm thinking about colonial contexts or, European adventurer collectors in the 19th and 20th centuries. But I would be curious to know if there's been any reflection on how that has impacted the field, because I know, Alessandro, at least from the introduction to your hand list, that there are, and you mentioned them here too, there are a number of collections in Europe and North America. And so I'm curious to know, has anybody reflected on the politics of those things being there and what that means for the field? And a final quick one, just another kind of selfish one for Anne about physical features. So you showed us a couple of bindings, which were really exciting, and a couple of hints about how those unbound quires suggest something about manuscript usage. And I'm curious to hear more examples about decoration or scripts or internal elements from these that can also point to circulation, like marginalia, collation statements, all kinds of things that might tell us a little bit more about how the texts were actually used in practice. Alessandro mentioned in particular that they're often read aloud and used, as a community, which is something, of course, not unique to the region, but it's important for us to remember, right? Because we engage with them primarily as written objects and forget how communal they are. So I have to stop there, or I'll go on forever, but I'll just say, again, thank you so much for the opportunity to listen to these presentations and to engage with you in the conversation. It's been a real pleasure.